All right. Section 10 is the home stretch of our key terms and definitions. From there, we'll move on and continue our studies. First up, the letter I, informed compliance, something we spoke of when we defined the Customs Modernization Act. This is important for a lot of different reasons. It is the U.S. CBP principle found in the Mod Act that requires an importer of record, which we just defined in the last section as well, to use reasonable care to enter, classify, and determine the value of imported merchandise. Think about this. Proper country of origin, proper classification, proper valuation. As the importer, whether we work with a customs broker or not, it is on us to exercise reasonable care by engaging in this idea of informed compliance. Here's the essence of that informed compliance principle. Whereas U.S. CBP will make public its laws and regulations as part of the principle of shared responsibility, it is the responsibility of the importer to comply with all laws and regulations related to entering goods into the commerce of the U.S. There's no way around this. We certainly, as an importer, can't blame the customs broker for submitting information that was incorrectly provided by us as the importer. Informed compliance found in the Mod Act is very explicit about that. Customs makes the information available, the regs and the laws available. We have to understand them, and we have to take reasonable care in engaging in all facets of our relationship with U.S. CBP and partner government agencies. Two shorter definitions: intended use, something we spoke of also when we talked about essential character. But intended use is a customs principle through which goods can be classified based on the purpose for which a product is used, and not exclusively its essential character. We used an example of toy tools that actually have some utility in that they could be used as a tool, but because their intended use is for a child as a toy, the classification will be different. Liquidation, something we haven't mentioned at all yet, but will towards the end of this module. We save it for the end because it's actually the tail end of a customs entry process. We say that because liquidation is the process through which CBP completes its review of an entry and finalizes duty payments. When we as an importer, using our customs broker, submit an entry, we're not telling customs what the duties are. We're providing them with an estimate of what the duties are. Liquidation states that customs has essentially a year to come back and say, okay, we agree with your original estimate of duties owed, and we liquidate the entry, we close the file, or they can come back and say the goods were classified wrong, you, Mr. or Ms. Importer, owe us an additional $10,000. But liquidation is the final step in the customs entry process through which CBP says we're good, or there's some additional monies owed. It's not very often, if at all, that customs comes back and says, oh, we made a mistake and we owe you money. It's usually the other way around. Power of attorney. We have a great example of a power of attorney in upcoming sections. For the moment, the POA, as it's called, it's a legal instrument through which an importer of record authorizes a customs broker to act on its behalf in an agency capacity specific to the filing of entries and related CBP activities. That's a long sentence. Really what it says is that if we as an importer of record are going to use a customs broker to file entries on our behalf, we have to give them a power of attorney to do that, permission to do that. Just as a clarification, in general terms, sometimes people think of a power of attorney as giving someone the right to have access to a bank account or somebody's assets. That's a different type of power of attorney. When we're talking customs, it's a permission that an importer gives to a broker to act on their behalf in an agency capacity. Second definition here, preferential duty program. We'll see lots of examples of this, but it's normally offered to multiple countries for purposes of economic development. And basically, a preferential duty program allows for the importation of goods from beneficiary countries at a lower duty rate than other countries. The United States plays favorites. with different countries around the world for lots of different reasons that we won't go into. But a preferential duty program allows for a foreign country to export to the United States, and the importer in the U.S. can bring the goods in at a duty rate lower than other countries that don't participate in the preferential duty program would have to pay. The key word here is preferential. There's lots of examples. GSP being the biggest one, Generalized System of Preferences, which we will talk about. A preferential duty program and a free trade agreement are not the same thing. Preferential duty program are lower duties on imports coming into the country from specific countries. It does not mean that we as the United States, as exporters, have the same benefits in the destination country. That's a different story. That's a free trade agreement. We'll talk more about preferential duty programs later on. A couple of very important definitions on this slide. We'll start with price paid or payable, which is a term we've used already. We talked about it a bit on the front end of the module. It came up again when we spoke of assists. Let's bring a little bit more definition to the term. For purposes of valuation, and we can stop right there and say that the price paid or payable is about putting a value on the goods so we can determine, based on the classification and country of origin of the goods, how much we're going to have to pay in customs duties as the importer. So, for purposes of valuation, the transaction value of merchandise plus any packing costs incurred by the buyer, selling commissions paid by the buyer, assists, which we saw in a real-world example, plus any royalty or licensing fee the buyer pays as a condition of purchase. We've talked a lot about unit price of an imported product, the price of the product at the door of the vendor's factory. We talked a little bit about FOB value as well. This definition elaborates on what actually makes up the value of an imported item. It's the transaction value, the unit price, the FOB value of the goods, plus any packing costs incurred by the buyer, any selling commission that the buyer has to pay, assists that we spoke of, plus something we hadn't mentioned, any royalty or licensing fee the buyer pays as a condition of purchase. If we in the United States represent a global brand and we're the distributor of a well-known global brand and we have to pay licensing fees for the right to have that representation and bring goods into the country from overseas, that's part of the price paid or payable. That's what that means. Right to make entry. Something we alluded to briefly, but very important from the perspective as the importer of record. And right to make entry states that per CBP regulations, only the importer of record has right to make entry as the purchaser or owner of imported merchandise in a transaction. Typically, it's the importer of record. We as the importer of record, especially when we show up on the documentation, the commercial invoice, the packing list, and especially the transport document, we have right to make entry. Importers of record are allowed to designate an agent to make entry on their behalf. Of course, we talked about that when we spoke of customs brokers. Right to make entry, pretty important concept. This is our last slide on key terms and definitions. But these definitions don't get any easier. Substantial transformation is a little bit tricky and not something we've talked about too much. This is a scenario where a product undergoes a fundamental change in form, appearance, nature, or character that results in an increase in value and a change of tariff classification. A product, a raw material that goes into a production process, loses its individual identity and becomes part of a new product that will have a different classification number. It has been substantially transformed. That is what substantial transformation means. And depending on the context, can have some real significance for importers. A quick example of that, and we mentioned it when we defined foreign trade zones, is that raw materials are imported from overseas into a foreign trade zone that happens to be a factory. The raw materials go into the zone without paying duties. They get put into a production process, turned into a car, to go back to our BMW example. And the raw materials lose their individual identity, and they come off the production line out of the zone as a car. all of those raw materials, all of those components have been substantially transformed. When the car enters into the commerce of the United States, it will do so under the classification of an automobile. Not hubcaps, not fenders, not doors, not engines, but a car. That's what substantial transformation means. And then finally, valuation. Talked a bunch about this. We don't have to spend too much time on it here. But it is the process of determining the true value of imported merchandise for purposes of assessing customs duties. That whole idea of the price actually paid or payable. All right. Thank goodness we got through part of our big grind on definitions, but that study of all of those definitions will pay dividends later on when we speak freely about all of these concepts, terms, and definitions. You as the student have to go back and study these definitions, so the value of what you get out of this module moving forward will be that much greater. When we come back, it's all about informed compliance and reasonable care. We'll see you then.